Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are witnessing one of the most shocking and historic turnarounds in modern warfare, a moment that few believed would ever become reality. Russia pushed out, Crimea fully retaken in a shocking comeback is not just a headline, it is a defining chapter in the long and brutal Russia-Ukraine war, a chapter that rewrites assumptions about power, occupation, and resistance. For years, Crimea stood as the ultimate symbol of Russian control, a heavily fortified peninsula that Moscow declared permanently absorbed into its territory. Its fall sends tremors far beyond the Black Sea, challenging narratives of inevitability and exposing the limits of military dominance when faced with determination, strategy, and time. The story of Crimea begins long before tanks rolled across borders and missiles struck cities. Crimea has always been more than land. It is identity, history, and strategic leverage. When Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, the operation was swift, calculated, and largely unopposed militarily. Ukrainian forces were unprepared, the international response was cautious, and Russia moved quickly to lock down the peninsula. Military bases were seized, Ukrainian flags came down, and Russian administration moved in. Moscow presented the annexation as final, irreversible, and protected by both military might and political resolve. Over the years, Russia invested heavily in Crimea, turning it into one of the most militarized regions in Europe. Advanced air defense systems, missile launchers, naval bases, and tens of thousands of troops transformed the peninsula into what many analysts described as an impenetrable fortress. For nearly a decade, Crimea appeared frozen in time, locked under Russian control while the world debated sanctions, legality, and diplomacy. Ukraine, meanwhile, was forced to fight on multiple fronts. The conflict in eastern Ukraine drained resources, cost lives, and tested national unity. Yet, even during the darkest moments, Crimea remained central in Ukraine's national consciousness. Officially and unofficially, Kiev never accepted the loss. It became a long-term objective, not through reckless promises, but through quiet preparation. Ukrainian leaders understood that Crimea could not be retaken through emotion or symbolic gestures. It would require years of transformation, rebuilding the military, strengthening alliances, and learning from every mistake made on the battlefield. As the broader war escalated, particularly after Russia's full-scale invasion, the dynamics began to shift. Ukraine's armed forces evolved rapidly under pressure. Command structures improved, coordination with intelligence services deepened, and battlefield experience hardened units that had once been outmatched. Western support played a crucial role, not just through weapons, but through training, surveillance, and strategic integration. Ukraine learned to fight smarter, not just harder. Precision replaced brute force. Information became as powerful as artillery. Slowly, methodically, Ukraine began shaping the battlefield far beyond the front lines. Crimea, once distant from daily fighting, started to feel the pressure. The first signs were subtle: explosions at ammunition depots, strikes on radar systems, disruptions to logistics routes. Each incident sent a clear signal that Crimea was no longer untouchable. Russian authorities tried to downplay the events, blaming accidents or isolated sabotage. But for soldiers stationed on the peninsula, the message was unmistakable. The war had arrived. The promise of safety, of being far from danger, was gone. Morale began to crack as uncertainty spread. Ukraine's strategy was not built around a single decisive assault. Instead, it focused on isolation and attrition. Crimea's geography, once seen as a defensive advantage, became a vulnerability. The peninsula relies heavily on limited supply routes connecting it to mainland Russia. Bridges, ports, and air corridors became critical pressure points. Ukrainian forces targeted these lifelines with precision, forcing Russian logistics into chaos. Supplies became irregular, reinforcements risky, and evacuation plans uncertain. Each successful strike tightened the noose, slowly turning Crimea from a fortress into a trap. Psychological warfare played a central role in this phase. Ukrainian messaging intensified, aimed at both Russian troops and Crimean civilians. The narrative was consistent and relentless. Crimea would be liberated, and those who chose not to fight would survive. For Russian soldiers, many of whom were far from home and increasingly doubtful of the war's purpose, the psychological toll was immense. Being stationed in Crimea was once considered a privilege. It became a burden. Constant alerts, fear of precision strikes, and dwindling supplies eroded discipline and confidence. Desertions increased. Units grew isolated not just physically, but mentally. Civilians in Crimea, living under years of occupation, experienced this shift in their own way. Surveillance, repression, and forced loyalty had silenced open resistance, but resentment never disappeared. Underground networks quietly gathered information, tracked movements, and passed intelligence onward. As Ukrainian operations intensified, hope resurfaced. The occupation had promised stability, but delivered militarization and isolation. Tourism collapsed, economic opportunities shrank, fear became routine. Liberation, once a distant dream, started to feel possible. The collapse of Russian control did not come from a single catastrophic defeat, but from cumulative failure. Air defenses that once dominated the skies were systematically degraded. Naval assets faced growing threats, reducing Russia's ability to project power from the Black Sea. Command centers were disrupted, communication lines fractured, and coordination faltered. Russia faced an impossible dilemma: reinforce Crimea and weaken other fronts, or hold elsewhere and risk losing the peninsula. Delays, internal disagreements, and overconfidence compounded the problem. What began as a controlled occupation unraveled into strategic paralysis. As Ukrainian forces closed in, the narrative shifted globally. Analysts who once dismissed the idea of Crimea's liberation began revising their assessments. Media coverage changed tone. Allies grew more confident. Neutral observers reconsidered long-held assumptions about military power and deterrence. Crimea was no longer a static symbol of Russian dominance. It was an active battlefield, and Russia was losing control. The final phase unfolded with calculated restraint and overwhelming pressure. Ukrainian forces advanced methodically, avoiding unnecessary destruction while maintaining relentless momentum. Russian units, cut off and demoralized, faced stark choices. Some surrendered, others withdrew under fire. Positions that once bristled with defenses were abandoned, not because weapons were gone, but because belief was gone. The occupation collapsed not in a single dramatic explosion, but in a quiet, unstoppable unraveling. When Ukrainian flags rose across Crimea, the moment resonated far beyond the peninsula. It was not just territory reclaimed, but history corrected. For Ukraine, it was proof that patience, sacrifice, and unity could overcome even the most entrenched occupation. For Russia, it was a devastating blow to credibility, prestige, and strategic confidence. The loss of Crimea shattered the myth of irreversible conquest and exposed the limits of power based on fear and force. Internationally, the implications were profound. Allies who supported Ukraine saw confirmation that their commitment mattered. Deterrence theories were rewritten. Nations facing pressure from stronger neighbors took note. The liberation of Crimea sent a clear message that occupation is not destiny, and that borders imposed by force can be challenged and reversed. It reshaped security calculations across Europe and beyond, yet liberation also brought responsibility. Years of occupation left scars that could not be erased overnight. Infrastructure damage, displaced families, and deep social divisions demanded careful attention. Ukraine faced the challenge of restoring governance while protecting civilians and ensuring justice without revenge. Rebuilding trust would take time, healing would require patience, but unlike occupation, liberation offered choice, dignity, and a future shaped by the people themselves. For Ukrainians, Crimea's return became a defining national moment, a story of endurance passed from one generation to the next. Soldiers who fought on distant fronts saw their sacrifices vindicated. Families separated by borders and checkpoints saw reunification within reach. The idea of a sovereign, indivisible Ukraine was no longer theoretical. It was proven. Russia pushed out, Crimea fully retaken in a shocking comeback will be studied for decades. Military academies will analyze the strategy. Historians will debate the turning points. Political leaders will draw lessons about power, patience, and the cost of miscalculation. Above all, it will stand as a reminder that occupation breeds resistance, that fear has limits, and that even the strongest fortresses can fall when cut off from legitimacy and belief. As the dust settles over the Crimean Peninsula, one truth stands clear. This was not just a military victory, but a moral one. A statement that sovereignty matters, that time favors those who endure, and that history is not written only by the powerful, but by those who refuse to accept loss as permanent. Crimea's shocking comeback is no longer a prediction or a hope. It is reality, and its echoes will shape the world for years to come.